Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today on the Dairy Signal. We're going to be talking about milking frequency, especially with those automated milking systems here this afternoon and the research behind it. But before we dive into that, it wouldn't be a Dairy Signal without a little bit of history and some fun facts for you here this afternoon. And today is definitely one of those that is an interesting fun fact, if you will, as there's not a whole heck of a lot that was really momentous in today in history. So instead, we're just heading back to 1982, where leg warmers, neon leotards, and big hair were all the rage, as it was on this day that Jane Fonda's first workout video was released. But let's dive into why we are here in the dairy sector and what we're looking forward to this afternoon by listening to some research that's been going on with quite a few universities as we look at some of the new technology and how it can really be optimized for our dairy operations, especially with milking frequency. And joining us this afternoon, we have Dr. Chuck Nicholson, who's the Associate Professor in the Department of Animal and Dairy Sciences and Agriculture and Applied Economics at UW-Madison, as well as Jalissa Beaudry, who is a graduate student in the Agricultural and Applied Economics Department with UW-Madison as well. So welcome, both of you. Thank you for joining us here today. Jalissa, I know it's your first time joining us here on the Dairy Signal. Would you mind giving us a brief introduction about yourself?
Yeah. So my name is Jalissa Beaudry. I grew up on a Minnesota dairy farm, so don't hold that against me. But I did come to Wisconsin for school. I did my undergraduate degree at River Falls in Wisconsin, and I studied agricultural business there. And then I continued over to UW-Madison, and now I'm a graduate student studying agricultural and applied economics, looking at the impact of milking frequency on automatic milking systems.
Well, thank you for joining us here. And Dr. Nicholson, welcome back. I know it's been a minute since we've had you on, and this is a little bit of a different capacity, if you will, but thanks for joining us here today. And for those who maybe aren't familiar with you and your work, would you mind giving them an introduction?
Yeah, sure. Thanks a lot for having us, Amber. So I'm Chuck Nicholson. As you mentioned, I work at UW-Madison. I'm a dairy economist. I've been doing this for a while. As you might be able to tell if you see some gray hair in the little box on your screen there. Work on a variety of different kind of dairy industry issues. This is actually one of the areas that I've been really intrigued by, which is really thinking more about how we can bring economics and business analysis to the role that automated milking systems play here in Wisconsin and nationwide. So my role is mostly to be here and say, you go, Jalissa, and presentations about the stuff that you've been working on, really interesting stuff. And I guess I'll also say that this is a collaborative effort, as you noted, specifically funded by the Dairy Innovation Hub at UW-Madison, but also with collaboration at UW River Falls. And we actually even have somebody all the way out to UC Davis who was at River Falls and then made a transition out to the Dairy Extension team out in California, who is a part of this work. So this is very definitely kind of a group effort that we're talking about here.
Well, I think that's what makes research special in this way is that, it is collaborative. You get to see it from a lot of different angles and a lot of different minds putting in all the hard work to come up with some really interesting questions and research proposals to ask. So we're excited to dive into it here this afternoon. And I do have to say, for those who are watching live, feel free to ask your questions via Slido. We'll be taking those either throughout today's episode or throughout today's presentation. Otherwise, at the end, we'll be getting to majority of those questions. But with all of that being said, Jalissa, I'm going to pass it over to you to get us started.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much, Amber. And so, yes, as Amber said, we are looking at the impact of milking frequency and automated milking systems on milk production and milk revenue today. And as Chuck said, this is a collaborative, a collaboration across multiple universities, UC Davis, UW River Falls, and UW-Madison, supported through the Dairy Innovation Hub. So the outline of the presentation today, we're going to look at the background as to why am I doing this research or why is this research important? Look at the research objectives, which is looking at performance thresholds in automatic milking systems, which is abbreviated as AMS. And then looking at methods and data, our key findings and the implications of this research. So a little bit of background on AMS is that adoption is growing. Farms tend to adopt AMS to reduce hired labor and increase profitability. There's an existing research focus on should or shouldn't you adopt AMS, and less studies that prioritize management once you have automatic milking systems in place. And so we want to look at like key performance metrics, key performance thresholds, and how do they affect animal productivity and returns in AMS. So on the right-hand side, the graphic there is from a paper that looked at farmers' perceptions on implementing AMS. And so they named a couple of things of the decision-making process, AMS technology, housing and management, labor perceptions, and herd performance and cow health as some of the perceptions that farmers think about when adopting AMS. And then a more recent study, it looked at the milking frequency in automatic milking systems as well. And what they found is that cows being milked 6 times per day produce higher milk yield and milk fats, which were greater than cows that were milked 3 times a day. And our study, this relates to our study because we specifically looked at getting from less than 3 times a day milking to an average above 3 times a day milking within the first 21 days of a cow's lactation. What makes our study different than this study is that they did not assess the economic impact of increased milking frequency, and specifically how shifting to a management setting of a higher milking frequency would affect farm profitability, given the potential changes in operational costs and labor requirements. So moving on to our project objectives, we wanted to determine the factors that most significantly influence average milk production per cow in herds using AMS. We wanted to quantify the relationship between the early establishment of high milking frequency, which is that 3 times a day milking by the first 21 days in milk, on the production of milk components and milk yield. And then we wanted to determine the influence of pellet feeding allocation during milking on milk yields and returns. How does the pellet feeding in AMS affect these outcomes? For our project data then, we looked at 5 farms with guided flow AMS units. That was about 1,200 cows, and we aggregated it to daily values, which was about 150,000 observations. We looked at early lactation data for 130 cows. We had data from day 1 of lactation through at least day 50 in milk. From that data, we had about 10,600 observations. And then we identified cows with a mean milking frequency of above 3 in our data set. Then our analysis period was tracked through the 150 days. And so the graphic on this screen is just looking at a cow's lactation curve from day 0 in milk to day 100 in milk. So our project methods is for our statistical analysis, we used a random effect model, which accounted for multiple observations for each cow. We controlled for farm-specific effects. We assessed the impact on daily milk yield of AMS milking frequency and controlled for days in milk and lactation number. We then determined the impacts of achieving an average of 3 times a day milking on subsequent milk yields and controlled for days in milk and lactation number again with that model. For our economic analysis, we had a financial impact assessed with the U.S. all milk price from the National Agricultural Statistics Service. We used federal milk marketing orders, component prices, and then we used a range of pellet prices to calculate the marginal cost and marginal revenue for that. So for our results, we found that increasing the number of milkings per day tends to produce nearly 6 pounds more milk per day than the first lactation cows. We found that milking frequency had a strong and statistically significant positive effect. And so we have a graph here we have a chart here of our coefficients for our model, which shows that the increasing number of milkings per day by 1 was associated with an average gain of 33.27 pounds of milk per cow per day when we're holding all of the other variables constant. The negative coefficient, these are in the red box there on the screen, the negative coefficient of the milking frequency squared term, which is negative 2.32, suggests that there's diminishing returns to increased milking frequency, which aligns with our biological expectations. For example, milking frequency from 2 to 3 times a day often produces substantial gains, but a subsequent increase from 5 to 6 times a day would provide relatively smaller benefits than increasing from 2 to 3 times a day. And so we have a graph here on this screen, which shows the impact of an additional milking. And we see that as total milk yield increases with additional milkings, but the marginal milk yield decreases with additional milkings. From our data, our farms reported between 1 and 8 milkings per day. And then the financial aspect of this would be that from the first milking on average produces 30.9 pounds of milk. But by the 7th milking, it produces an additional 3.1 pounds of milk. And so it rapidly declines there from 1 to 7 milkings. And so for that first milking at the mean price, you would see an average of $6.89 in a gain versus by the 7th milking, you're only seeing a 68-cent increase in milk revenue per day per cow. Moving on to when you achieve the 3 times a day average by day 22, we see that days in milk and days in milk squared have significant effects. We also see that lactation number has a significant effect. And from our 5 farms, farms 1 and 2 had specific effects. So this found that an overall increase of 6 pounds of milk per cow per day from day 22 to day 150, which adds about an additional 775 pounds of milk during the first 150 days of lactation. Then we looked at the average financial impact of achieving 3 times a day milking, which was about $1.34 per cow per day at the mean milk price, $1.05 per cow per day at the minimum milk price, and $1.56 at the maximum milk price. This average was calculated from July of 2022 milk price through December of 2024 milk price. And so to put these results into context, assuming the mean value of milk for cows not achieving an average of 3 times a day by day 22, that would be a 93-pound average of milk per day. And the mean milk price would be 22 cents per pound of milk revenue. And so multiplying that all together, that would be a milk revenue of $20.46 per cow per day for cows that did not achieve 3 times a day milking, which thus is $1.34 with the price, the $1.34 per cow per day price of cows that did achieve an average of 3 times a day represents a 5.4% increase in daily per cow revenue. So getting to that 3 times a day milking produces that 5% increase in daily cow revenue for their milk yield. Now looking at the average component values of achieving 3 times a day milking, we are looking at the all 3 conditions variable, which identifies cows who met filtering criteria of having at least 50 observations, an observation at day 1, and there are less than 150 days in milk. And so with this specification, we find that lactation number consistently and significantly increases yield, reflecting a higher productivity and more experienced cows. And while the effect on days in milk is positive, there is a negative and significant squared term which indicates a concave quadratic relationship. And this pattern reflects an increase in protein production during early lactation. And then while the all 3 conditions variable is slightly positive, it is not statistically significant. Now looking at the results on the financial side of things, we see that butterfat increases provides 66% of the total revenue gain, which is butterfat with the average milk price is an additional 92 cents per day. Protein is additional 39 cents per day. Other solids is additional 7 cents per day, and your somatic cell would be an additional 2 cents per day. So that's about $1.40 milk revenue or component revenue increase per cow per day if that cow achieves that 3 times a day milking target by day 22. So an increase in overall revenue of $181 per cow for the days between days 22 and 150 in their days in lactation there. Now looking at the pellet results, so we identified each of the 5 farms because as we were looking through here, there was great variation between farms and their feeding strategy. And so on screen, there's a graph that shows the milk yield versus the average concentration consumption for farms 1 through 5, which just shows each farm in a different color in their feeding strategies. So based off of this graph and based off of our data, we decided to include interaction terms for each farm to account for the heterogeneity in their feeding responses. And so we added each farm multiplied by their concentrate to detect that farm level heterogeneity. With the pellet feeding impact, we see that an average concentrate consumption over the past 7 days is positively associated with yield with the coefficient 0.55, which confirms the role of cows getting nutrients from pellets in supporting milk production. We did see farm-specific effects were important in some cases, with each farm having a different strategy in their feeding style for the pellets. And then again, looking at the pellet feeding impact, we looked at incomplete milkings and kickoff milkings because we had data from the automatic milking system on that. And so we saw it's a reduction of nearly 6 pounds per cow per day with incomplete milkings. And that is looking at the mean, with the mean price, that's $1.29 per cow per day for the effect of an incomplete milking. And then for kickoff milkings, we saw that they could be possibly representing cows that are new adapters to the AMS. So meaning like your first calf heifers that are not used to the robot, or a cow that's not used to the robot could be some of the cows in that kickoff milkings grouping.
Jalissa, quick question here. We had a question that came in regard to the pellets, the feeding, and it reads, are all the pellet types the same?
No. So we use a range of pellet prices because each farm fed a different type of pellet. And so some were feeding just regular, I think, corn gluten pellets, and others had their own formulation of pellets. So we just use a range. That's why we have the average, minimum, and maximum.
And this is a tail question that I have from this then is, so when you were calculating for the different protein, fat, and all of that, was that adjusted when you were trying to figure out those ones, or how did that impact what you were looking at?
Yes. So for like the fat, protein, other solids pricing, we got that from Federal Milk Marketing Orders. So we just use that data. But in terms of any of the pellet pricing, we got that from a range of pellet prices.
Okay.
Does that kind of answer the question?
I think so. I think that's where we're going for now. That works perfect. So I'll let you continue on.
Okay. So here's another financial comparison of the pellet feeding. And this is based off of the milk pricing from the all milk price from the National Agricultural Statistics Service. And then the cost of the pellets was based off of our range of pellets. And so we see, based off of the estimated coefficients of the concentrate analysis, the cost of the concentrate in the feed brackets and the additional milk revenue it generates, with the difference in milk revenue minus the concentrate costs, our gains would range from 2 cents to -11 cents per pound of concentrate, depending on the milk price. And for those looking at the screen, it's the bottom bracket here shows the difference between the milk revenues and the cost per pound of concentrate, which would range from 2 cents to 11 cents there. In conclusion, the effects of getting to 3 times a day milking boost milk yield and component yields. Achieving an average of 3 times a day milking by day 22 represents about a 5.4% daily revenue increase per cow. And that's, daily is per day as well. The milking frequency is a key to influencing milk yield. As pellet feeding increases milk and sometimes even net returns. Early targeted practices improve milk revenue generation as well, which is kind of like the key of what we're trying to evaluate here is management practices in AMS systems. Some of the limitations of this study were the farm diversity. There's many factors not directly included in this analysis, such as other management practices like bedding, whether they scrape their alleys, cleaning practices. We didn't have any data on that to evaluate that. So that would be a study in the future would be great to look at some of those. There was a short time frame. Our analysis focused on one specific period, which was July of 2024 through December of 2024. And we had partial data access because we could not obtain like full production or component data from all the farms. We did for some farms, but not all. And so it would have been nice to look at all the farms. For our revenue focus, we only focused on revenue. We did not look at net returns or more of the costs associated with an automatic milking system farm. And then implications is that as additional milkings increase milk yield, but at a decreasing rate. So this is showing the cost benefit analysis on the additional milk and feeding. And then achieving an average of 3 times a day milking by day 22 increases subsequent milk production. So applying these strategies to achieve this objective, farms would see an increase in subsequent milk production. Our acknowledgements is that we want to thank the farmers who shared their data. We also want to thank the DeLaval representatives that we worked with, Richard Franta, Lindsay Schilling, and Natalie Weimer. We want to thank professional dairy producers for providing this platform with us to share this information. And then thank the UW Innovation Hub, our UW Dairy Innovation Hub, for sponsoring this project. And thank you for our attention. Our emails are on the screen if you have any questions. I'll be happy to take them.
Well, Jalissa, thank you for that information and going through. I mean, there's a lot of questions that I have as well as some that we've got through Slido here that we'll be going through. So very interesting research, especially when it comes to the cost and as well as the revenue side of things in management terms. I give you guys a lot of credit in being able to use 5 different farms, real life farms. That's a lot of work, especially when accounting for the differences in management and style and variety that come with being part of the dairy sector. So kudos to you guys on that first off. But next, I'm going to start with some of the questions that came in. And the first one here on Slido reads, for this project, were all cows milking 3X? Did it ever become an issue with turning cows fast enough through the AMS systems during the day?
Yes, so we calculated the average of not all the cows are milking 3 times a day. And so we calculated that average based off of, we had data for if like from their first day of lactation through their 150th day of lactation. And so some cows, they might have been milking 2 times a day. Some of them might have been milking 4 times a day. We just took the average of if their average was above 3 times per day, 3 times per day by their 22nd day of lactation. Is how we calculated that 3 times a day milking. And so, yes, we did have data that was for cows that didn't achieve that, I guess.
Yeah, maybe I'll just jump in and add a little bit. Yeah, so we had information on how many milkings for all the cows that were in the data set in that early lactation period. Jalissa mentioned, I think there are about 130 cows that met the criteria to allow us to look at that. And the question of whether or not getting to 3X makes a difference actually was something that came from our friends at DeLaval, because they basically said, we think this is how it should work. And so they were really interested in having that be one of the key things that would be evaluated. What is the subsequent impact on the productivity of the animal from that beyond that transition period into mid-lactation? And can we quantify kind of what the economic benefits are of doing that? So they actually really sort of teed that up for us as a part of the specific question. And I think you already noted, it's actually pretty challenging to work through the data from 5 very different farm configurations, and think about how you're going to turn that into something that's useful. So I think Jalissa's done a great job in kind of getting us very far along that pathway.
Okay, next question here reads, you mentioned lactation number had an impact. What was that impact, and was it more or less milk during the 3X depending on lactation?
Yeah, we found that cows in later lactations did produce more milk. As like a biological pattern would suggest is cows in later lactations produce more milk. And so the impact was greater as well for cows in later lactations.
Yeah, and I think you'll have to help me if I'm not remembering this right, Jalissa, but I think in our statistical analysis, we found about 5, 6 pounds a day as a lactation number increase. So
Yeah, I
kind of
want to
on
say,
go ahead.
yeah, I think it was like 5.27 or 5.97.
We didn't
That's
get
close to
lost in the
six.
decimals. I think that's okay. So it's kind of roughly 5 for each additional lactation. Looking across, we actually had 1,200 cows total for that kind of analysis. So looking across that many cows, that's what we were looking at.
Okay. And another question or portion off that is for some of these cows they were looking at, and I know you were only looking at data between July and December. So that makes it, kind of a smaller set that you were looking at in terms of numbers. But would you have any, if you were to just think about and put your thoughts to, if was a majority of later lactation cows that were going through 3X? Was it some of those younger lactation cows? What was the difference in terms of numbers between young versus, I don't want to say old because that sounds negative, but young versus old cows going through that much, that many of times? Words are hard. I apologize.
No, that's okay. Um, so yes, we did have cows at various stages in their lactation and like number of lactations as well. As for the comparison, I think that was just the regression model that we ran where we found that there's an average of 6 pounds gained with each lactation.
Yeah, so because part of the focus for this was to think about that early lactation period, the transition cow, and sort of test out this idea that getting to 3X on average during that first 3 weeks was going to be critical for the subsequent milk yields. We didn't actually look at like how stage of lactation affected how many times the cows were milking the AMS units. We have the data. We can go back and look at that now, and now we know that's something people want to know. So we can actually work with that too.
And then kind of going back to, you're talking about a lot of this is important by 21 days, and that's that transition period. And I'm curious to know, were there any health events or, any cows that, might have experienced some negative health interactions within that transition period? Did that skew any of the data? Was that accounted for, or how did you look at that in comparison?
Yeah, so health data was actually one that we wanted to get, but it was for each farm, it's so different in the way that they collect the health data. And so only one of our farms actually inputs the health data into the AMS system. And so that was something that a future study would be great to look at because we weren't able to see how, like, yeah, if a cow had a drop in milk production, we weren't able to correlate that with the health event because we didn't have that data.
Yeah, and I guess I'll also just add that we tried to account for some of the differences among farms by kind of controlling for that with the statistical methods that we have. That's an imperfect way to think about how many health events were taking place in the herd on those different farms, but at least it has some way of helping us think a little bit about where some of those differences might arise. But I agree completely with Jalissa. The big challenge is the AMS units themselves put out lots of data, but they don't put out all the data that you might want to have to be able to evaluate the factors that are influencing the milk yields in addition to the number of milkings and the way the AMS units are operating. So we had like tons and tons of data. We had good cooperation for some of the farms to collect information from their DHIA systems to get the component yields from the cows. Uh, we did learn that it's actually pretty challenging to have all the stuff that you want to be able to help better explain and control for the management component that we're interested in looking at.
I mean, that is definitely a challenge. I can only imagine the challenge to get the information you need and be able to disseminate why certain things happen the way they did when going through and creating your analysis. One of the questions about the pellets and the various different strategies that the farms had, how did you account for the variation between, how much they were feeding? Because I recall looking at that graph and it had very different ideas and strategies and management styles going forward for that. So how did you account for that when you're going through your analysis?
Yeah, that's where we added the interaction terms between the farms and their amount of concentrate they were feeding or amount of pellet concentrate that they were feeding. And so with those interaction terms, it took the effects of those different farms, which then when we were running our models, was accounting that each farm was a little bit different than the other farm.
That makes sense. Okay. You know, I'm going to have you do a little bit of thinking outside of the Wisconsin, outside of the five farms that you worked with. But when we're thinking about this in terms of this probably can hold true in terms of how this research stands for a lot of Midwest AMS style farms. When thinking about this on a larger scale, when thinking about this, especially with, you know, maybe a little bit of UC Davis thrown in there and some California ideas, how would this, do you think this will hold up in terms of research when thinking about AMS style farms across the US? Is it more going to be better looked at regionally? What are your thoughts in comparison from Wisconsin to how it might compare across various other farms who might be listening?
Yeah, I especially the getting to the average of 3 times a day milking in the first 21 days, I think it would hold up no matter where you are in the world, because most cows follow the same biological pattern of they have a calf, their first 21 days of their lactation, they're very susceptible to disease, and so we wanted to see if they were susceptible to milk more higher milking frequency. And so I think no matter where the cow is in the world, if she gets to that average of 3 times a day milking by that 22nd day in her lactation, I think she will see an increase over her lactation. And from our research findings, that's about a 6 pound increase per cow per day.
Okay.
And maybe I'll also just weigh in a little bit that I agree with Jalissa that we're likely to see some of the same kinds of effects, like getting to 3x milking in that first 21 days is going to be important. It's going to yield benefits throughout the rest of lactation. These 5 herds actually represented kind of a range of milk production, but generally a bit on the higher average side. So that actually helps us to think a little bit about how this might be extended to think about other parts of the country. But I think one of the things that this has demonstrated is that we can provide some relevant information, but there's lots more to be done, including, hey, what if we go to Minnesota? Or what if we went out to California? And how would that be different? I think part of the context for this is that we are really still at fairly early stages in having farms think about and adopt AMS technologies. We have some that have been doing it for a while, even here in Wisconsin, but it's a newer idea. And the whole motivation for Jalissa's work has been that we don't fully understand how to kind of optimize the management systems on these farms, what factors are going to be important. And so this is a good starting point, provides an example that can be done in other places and find out, does it work exactly the same or does it work a little bit differently? If we had more than 5 farms, that would probably make a difference too. And so I think as with all kinds of research, we learn some stuff, and then a lot of times we learn what it is that we need to learn next. So that's, I think, kind of where we are with this.
Which I think is a fair assessment and fair to say is and the beauty of research in and of itself is that you're not going to get all the answers and it tends to lead to more questions than it does when you started a project. But going back to, these 5 farms and knowing that they're guided flow and likely with DeLaval, given, the support and the questions that they posed and I not going one way or the other with it. But, as you think about this and as, research continues, what are some of those other questions that you do want to ask in terms of optimizing that management? Like you were talking about, Dr. Nicholson, what's next in terms of where is yet to go with this?
Yeah, I think looking at other management practices such as like feeding strategy, we really wanted to get, or like another aspect of research would be looking at like what are the cows being fed and how often are they being fed? Because with an AMS system, most farms have a partial mixed ration, a PMR, where the pellets are providing some sort of nutrition, but then most of the other nutrition is at the bunk. And so looking at how that management strategy and different feeding styles would have an impact on milk yield, milk components, or like, how animals are treated in the barn or what type of bedding are they using? Are they using a hydro flush or are they using a manure scraper in their alleys? just different management strategies in that aspect with the barn, but then also cow health events, looking at like how are cows being treated in their transition period? Are they in a separate pen from other cows? And then yeah, like I guess milking schedule depends on how the cow is feeling and our what is the fetching strategy of that farm. Or if a cow isn't coming up to the robot, how often are the employees going out and fetching that cow? Those kind of things.
Yeah, you can also think about the number of cows per milking unit as being something that we didn't fully control for here. And the other thing is, you may be wondering, hey, why did you stop at 150 days? And part of the reason for that is we were looking at data collection only over a period of about 6 months. And so I think that later lactation stage is also something that would be pretty important to look at. And so that would be for somebody who's going to follow in Jalissa's footsteps, that would be a great way to sort of extend the stuff that we've looked at here, because we really are looking at that sort of mid-lactation period through 150 days.
Well, and I mean, I think that's a great and very interesting way to put it is that, yes, you're looking from start to mid lactation. And one of the questions that, as we're talking here that popped into my head is, uh, and I hate to put a blanket term out there, but I'm definitely going to put a blanket so what we're saying is all cows should be milked 3 times a day by 21 days in milk. But does that impact or should that matter then within that 22 to 150? Should they still be milking 3x? And then from there, I know we didn't go past 150 days. So I'm going to ask it anyways. Should those cows then continue to be milking 3x or should they drop down to 2x depending on where they're at in that lactation stage?
Yeah. I think for the first 22 days, it's definitely worth the extra labor that it takes to go and fetch a cow if she's not being milked 3 times a day. But then after that day 22, there's not, I guess we didn't really look into that. And after that day 150, we definitely didn't have data to look into that. So for sure, for the first 22 days, it would be worth that for that extra 6 pounds per cow per day. That would be worth the extra labor to go and fetch that cow.
Always asking us the tough questions, Amber. But yeah, part of it is we have a lot of systems now. If you think about a parlor system where it's standard to do 3x, right? And we actually, some years ago, decided that that was generally speaking, if you could work out the configuration of the parlor, it was better to do that than to do 2x. So in general, we would expect that 3x milking frequency, or maybe even a little bit higher, would be something that would be good during the rest of that mid-lactation period. We were focusing initially on this question of when you're making that transition and getting that cow into the configuration with the robot in the barn, how important is getting to that threshold of 3x? And so another great question to follow on, how should that play out over the rest of lactation through 150 days and beyond that? Does it really still make sense? Jalissa, I think, did a nice job of showing that, and it's biologically, logical that the more you milk, the less additional milk you get out of the animal, right? So another way to think about that, if we're putting our economist hats on, is like, what's the best number? We can do more than 3 a day with the robots. Should it be 4? That would be another great question for us to think about for the future.
Yes, and I don't mean to be poking at things that you haven't looked at yet. I was just curious your guys' thoughts there. But as we begin to wrap up and we begin to end our discussion here today, one of the last questions I do have for you, Jalissa, is when we're thinking about the research that you've done here, what's kind of the 1 or 2 things that you really want producers, especially those who either are in an AMS system or maybe thinking about working with one, to be either thinking about or actively doing after today?
Yeah. I would love for farmers to, think about how their cows in their transition period are being affected by their milking frequency. So looking at if their cows are achieving an average of that 3 times a day milking, and then comparing that to their cows that aren't achieving. I had a farmer come up to me after the PDP business conference, and he actually said his farm is doing this and he's seen an impact. And so like hearing a real life story of that was really cool. And so that's what I would ask of farmers if they have automatic milking systems to try and get to that 3 times a day milking within the first 22 days of lactation, and that you should be seeing an increase in overall milk yield for that cow for the rest of her lactation. The other thing that I would, ask is we do research at UW-Madison is if farmers have questions on management strategies that they want to get asked, make sure they talk to somebody that does research, because that's how this research came about. Is the folks at Deal Valve, they had this question, and I needed something to research, so this worked out great.
Well, I have to say thank you so much for your time here, Jalissa and Dr. Nicholson. It's always fantastic to have research brought to life and to be thinking about it in a way of like, what can this actually mean for on farm? So I appreciate so much of your time here this afternoon. It's been fantastic.
Thanks a lot. I think everybody should know also that this is really hot off the presses. Jalissa's just finished writing this stuff up. And actually, in a couple of weeks, she'll have to go through dealing with all the other professors that are part of this research and answer their tough questions too. But I do want to say it's really great to have the opportunity to hear the kind of questions that come up in this sort of discussion that we might not have thought about that would be providing useful information for folks. So thank you again for the opportunity to kind of be a part of this and to get those questions. So now we know kind of what our next steps can be.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you so much for providing this opportunity, because in the next couple of weeks, I'll be presenting at the Dairy Innovation Hub Symposium on May 14th, if anybody is going to that as well. And so this just is another opportunity. So I appreciate that.
Well, good luck with that, Jalissa, and thank you both again for your time here today. And also thank you for those who asked your questions. We always appreciate your participation here on the Dairy Signal. And I hope that if you are ever wondering what is going on in the world of professional dairy producers, you're able to check us out over at our website at pdpw.org. But for now, have a great rest of your weekend, and we'll see you here next week on the Dairy Signal. Bye now.